so much, and wonderful contributions, all from different perspectives, but absolutely giving you the messages that we need to ensure that the public know that we do not gain greater control over our continent, over our country, by losing control in our continent. And I think it's absolutely crucial we get that message out. But this meeting is for you, so please do ask us some questions. Matthew will be answering on behalf of the Labour Party as well, but ask us what the issues that you think are important, but also how can we ensure that we win this referendum. So, yes, can I take 3 at a time? Have we got, would you like to stand up?
Just, I agree with the tenor of everything. I agree generally with what has been said, but I'm concerned that the Remain campaign might lose on the issue of control of borders and immigration. And I think all the arguments that are being put are, I think they're all logical, and I think they're all, in some ways, the wealthier people are, the easier they are to take on. What I want to know really is, what do people say when they go to places where people aren't really that well off, where they see firsthand often the arrival of a lot of people who disturb the atmosphere that they are used to having in their neighbourhood? What do we say to those people to try and persuade them that these are the issues that you've talked about are more important, and probably the worries about immigration aren't as important as... I mean, I know it's a difficult thing because obviously they confuse immigration. It's just anybody arriving from anywhere, and it's not necessarily to do with the European Union, but it's being used to, I think, to scare the British people into voting against. So
I think that's one of the most important points. We would definitely pick that up. And 2 more together. Yes, Jeff.
Veronica Hardstaff. Veronica Hardstaff. I'm a former member of Sheffield City Council, also a former member of the European Parliament in the 1990s. So I'll put a bit of a Labour viewpoint. And I think, and I will say that I spent last night sorting out Labour in leaflets, and I have a big pile in the back of my car to deliver during the rest of this week. I think for our Labour voters in places like Sheffield, we really need to look at the social dimension of Europe, and particularly the social chapter, workers' rights, the rights of women who are part-time workers to have paid holidays, and the right to occupational pensions. These are the sort of things that are going to make some difference. Also, places like South Yorkshire have had a huge amount of European social and regional funding at a time when our own government was actually quite happy to see our basic industries disappear, and it seems to be happening again now with new jobs. Job losses have only just been announced in the last 24 hours. The money that is coming in to help our area is not coming from our own government, which is busy cutting down funding to our local authority. It is coming in from the European Union. And I do believe that these are the facts which we hope we can get through to the people of this sort of area who perhaps see immigration, which has been mentioned, and to me, the point of dealing with that is to ensure that rogue employers are not deliberately bringing in people and having them employed as agency workers and then exploiting them outrageously. Not everybody is like that, but that is where a lot of the problems arise. And we shouldn't forget also all the British citizens within the EU who, like my son, are being deprived of being able to vote in this referendum.
Absolutely, thank you. There was another gentleman here, and then we'll give it to the panel.
Right, hi, Alan. It's more just a question on campaigning. A lot of people who are out say we'll just strengthen relations with the Commonwealth. From the panel, do you think it's bad to kind of almost take a pessimistic stance and just say, to be honest, what have we really got that would make the Commonwealth kind of take us back? So I don't want to kind of like I think one of the issues with the campaign has been it's a little bit doom and gloom. We leave the EU, everything will go horribly wrong, which I do think is true, but I think we need to have more of a positive message. And I kind of almost like just like ask actually to what extent should I attack the pessimism, you know, and trying to like convince people that actually this is all we've really got.
Shelley.
Let me say a first response to some of that. One of the things that many of you will know is that if you take the view that you want to stop immigration, there will be certain areas that will suffer hugely from that. When you go to your A&E or your NHS GP, in many, many cases, the person that will look after you will be from another country. If you go into an A&E, you will often find that the nurses are going to be Filipino, or they're going to be West Indian. They're going to be from somewhere else. No less than 135,000 people in the NHS are from other countries, some from Europe, some from the Commonwealth, but the NHS would literally begin to break down completely. Indeed, some of the A&E closures right now are attributed directly to an absence of staff able to actually staff. So let's be quite straightforward. There are two sides to the immigration problem, and one of these that many of our public services would simply break down without immigrants that are staffing them. The second point is a different one, and it's a different level. If you look at some of the work that we're doing in research and development, they consist of mixed teams of young scientists from all over the world. We've tried to keep them out. In particular, our Home Secretary has tried to keep them out. And the scientists themselves have come back and said, please don't do that to us, because it's limiting what we can achieve. So while I would certainly agree that there are people who feel that they don't want to have immigrants around them, there are many other people who are full of congratulations and thanks for the service that they've received. And I think we've got to get across the fact that there's a very, very mixed outcome, and some of that outcome is very good indeed.
Caroline, do you want to cover off whichever issue you would like to?
Thank you. Well, just on that first question about immigration, all I would do is to, first of all, say I think you're absolutely right to raise it. We need to have good answers on that. And I would just add to what Shirley said maybe, is to point to the fact that when you're talking about people coming in from other EU countries, they are bringing a net economic benefit as well as a net benefit to our communities in many other ways as well. And I think we could be talking perhaps seriously about using the so-called immigration dividend. In other words, using some of the money that they are bringing with them, because they are by and large coming to work, to use some of their taxes and so forth, to be able to invest in the schools and hospitals in the areas that are under greatest pressure. Because notwithstanding everything that Shirley has said, I think we do need to acknowledge that if you have a sudden influx of a lot of people in a small place, there are pressures. And I think we do need to acknowledge that. But we also need to have some solutions to how we would begin to address it. And I think that is one practical way of doing it. Veronica rightly reminds us about all of the important workers' rights and the social chapter and so forth, and she's absolutely right. And I think we could also remind the Brexit campaign that, of course, Boris is completely on record from 2012 saying scrap the social chapter. So it's not, you know, the future that he has in mind is not that mysterious. We can kind of see it, and it doesn't look like a very pleasant one. And then the final question about the Commonwealth, I guess the point to me would be that we don't need to be choosing between the Commonwealth and the EU. You'll hear many Brexit campaigners kind of pretending that if we didn't have free movement of people within the EU, we'd suddenly have a government that would be opening its arms to far more people coming in from Commonwealth countries. And just knowing the difficulties that I've already experienced as an MP trying to get, you know, the families of Commonwealth individuals in my constituency to be able to join them just for a wedding or something like that, it's almost impossible. The idea that the government's going to suddenly change its very punitive immigration policy once we're out of the EU, I think is a bit of a fantasy. But I do take on board your last point about the importance of having an upbeat, positive campaign, and I really do believe that. I think that that this whole kind of Project Fear, and there is some of that sadly on both sides, is just putting people off. And if, as Laura reminded us when we first started this meeting, that turnout is crucial, then nothing is going to put people off more than just having people slagging each other off and telling us all it's all going to be doom and gloom. So I think we need some positive visions of what the EU could be like, the positive visions about, you know, how young people want to think about the EU. And there are some great campaigns, like one called We Are Europe, who are young people peer-to-peer, using social media, just sort of celebrating aspects of the EU. And my last point on that would be, you know, for me, free movement itself is something we should stop apologising for and start celebrating. I think it is nothing short of amazing that we can live and love and work and retire in 28 different member states. How extraordinary is that? How wonderful is that? How amazing is it that instead of resorting to bullets and bombs, we do actually try to solve things by debate and discussion, however laborious that may be. I think those are really important things to be celebrating, and we should be doing that, not kind of, you know, apologising for them in a grumbly sort of way.
Cover a little, but just on this latter point about optimism versus pessimism. First, of course, I strongly agree with Caroline, and by the way, I'm sort of, by way of my DNA, condemned to agree with that. Anyway, my dad's half Russian, my mum's Dutch, I'm married to a Spaniard. I'm sort of the genetic experiment in European integration, so, and I think it's a very good thing, so I feel very optimistic about it. So, and of course, the tone needs to be this sort of hectoring, finger-pointing tone is always very unattractive. But can I just stick up for a minute as a sort of pragmatic campaigner for not pessimism, but for kind of the realism of some of the messages which are directed at undecided voters in the latter stages of the campaign. I mean, let's be very candid here. Many people, I think, are members of political parties here. At this stage in the campaign, the people who've made up their mind one way or the other are largely, they're not in play anymore. People like, I suspect most of us here, will vote in, come hell or high water, or people like Nigel Farage, who's bussing around some other part of Sheffield today, getting lost, I'm told, and getting his bus stuck in the cricket ground. Excellent. You know, we're not in play, right? So the only people who matter electorally, everybody's vote counts with equal weight, are the people who haven't made up their mind, or who are no sort of fixed abode, or rather, don't care about Europe very much. And it's very important for us enthusiasts to remember that for many, many people, this just isn't very important. For them, the NHS, apprenticeships for their kids, affordable housing in the local community is more important. And so I think it is right to make sure that in the latter stages, the messages, that the means in which one tries to communicate with those people who are not bluntly, between now and the 23rd of June, going to love the European Union, or be swept up by the poetry of internationalism and comradeship with our neighbouring European countries, but who may, when push comes to shove, decide that at the end the risks of leaving are greater than the inconveniences of staying, if I can put it that way. I think it's not a pessimistic message, but it does need to be quite a realistic message that that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to tip those people, not towards the sort of fervour that is quite rightly on display here, but more that for them, as they make that sort of calculation of what the balance of risks are, that they make the calculation in favour of our staying. And that's why I do think the European message, much though I of course agree with Caroline, it can of course be a bit monotonous, I do think it's tremendously, tremendously important. Because it is tremendously important, because it relates directly to people's welfare and well-being in the future.
So, just to answer a few of the questions, with the Commonwealth argument, it's just to reiterate Caroline's point that you don't have to choose the Commonwealth or Europe. In fact, you can go one further in that the European Union actually strengthens a lot of the benefits to the Commonwealth, which is why we've seen the Canadian government and the Indian government come out and strongly back us staying within the European Union. On the campaigning point around immigration, it's something that I come across a lot in my political work as well as with the European movement. It's something which we need to take people on a journey and show them that not all of life's problems are necessarily down to an often scapegoated minority. We need to show that actually a lot of the problems are through underinvestment. We know that people who come over to the UK as economic migrants actually end up putting back into the economy 1.5 times more than they take out, because they tend to be young, fit, healthy people who come here for work. They tend to put a lot more in terms of taxation. They don't take many services from the NHS and their local doctors. They tend not to have family connections when they first move here, so they're not using the education system largely, and they're actually a net contribution to our economy. And that's something which is essentially down to government policy if those taxes they're paying are not being put back into vital services that we have. And just very lastly, on the social Europe point, this is something I come across almost daily, is people on the left who try to argue for an exit of the European Union, whereby they try to say that Europe is essentially a capitalist club. It's the same argument that we saw back in 1973-74. And we need to remember that a capitalist club would not allow people to do 48-hour working weeks. A capitalist club would not allow people to have maternity leave. A capitalist club would not allow a Robin Hood tax, which was only vetoed by the UK government. So there was huge arguments from a left point of view of why to stay in Europe, as well as the traditional type of business arguments. And a lot of these arguments put forward for the Lexit, essentially, are complete hogwash. They do not stand up to any scrutiny. So that is the argument that I would make regarding the importance of a social Europe, especially when speaking to any people who are against Europe, not for immigration reasons, but for large, big business reasons.
Thank you. And although this is meant to be a progressive panel, as a Conservative, may I just say a few things? Have you met John Redwood recently? I want this poster which has got Nigel Farage, John Redwood and Douglas Carswell saying, do you want to give these men your maternity rights? Because this is not about Europe for them. This is not the European project. This is a much bigger project. It's called the Brave New World project. And it is about unravelling social Europe. It is unravelling environmental Europe. It is unravelling collaborative Europe. And this is quite a specific ideology. And so that is why, and I find it strange that the Remain don't know that they can actually pin the vision onto the Brexiteers, because the vision is clear, and Caroline mentioned it quite explicitly. And it is a place without social protection. Matthew also very, very clear from why the Labour Party wants, or some parts of the Labour Party want us to come out. It is a brave new world. It is the Singapore of Europe. It is a very, very harsh, aggressively capitalist, aggressively libertarian vision. And anybody who looks back at any of the pamphlets, any of the information that has come through those people who've been very, very clear about wanting to leave, there is a vision. Nail it on them. Don't let them get away with it. One very important point, which was about the Commonwealth, and Matthew quite rightly said, we actually give them preferential trading rights into the EU. But we haven't used the C word, maybe because this isn't necessarily conservative. What is the Churchill word? Churchill's concentric circles. He had a very clear, specific vision about this country. And when you're meeting people who are very much, who use his name, and I have to say I find it rather resentful, he was the first president of the European movement. When they use his name in vain, he talked about us sitting at the heart of Europe, at the centre of a relationship with America and North America as a whole, and our position with the Commonwealth. We can have it all. It's Churchill's concentric circles, and it is EU plus the rest of the world, not the rest of the world minus the EU. Thank you. Oh, the hands are going up. We've got 4 questions in this round.
I was going to say, I'm one of the few people who are as yet undecided, which is why I'm here. And I'd say the main argument with immigration is one thing, that the people who weren't born in the UK have the same amount of jobs as the level of unemployment is. So the simple maths is, if they weren't there, there'd be no unemployment. I'd say that's not necessarily my personal view, but that would just be, that's a fact that's there. Whether or not people do the jobs is irrelevant. But also, you said the EU needs improving, but will it negatively affect us whilst we're there improving it? So would it be better to leave it and try and improve it from the outside? Because if, as you said yourself, it needs improving. So would we be better outside whilst it's improving, and then, if necessary, rejoin later? And also, and there's, my final point is there concern that refugee crisis will destabilise the EU?
Very important points. Yes, this gentleman here. And then 5, 6. Can we keep them a little tight? Brilliant, thank you.
I'm an engineer. I've worked all my life in a great engineering company. And I'd just like to ask you why you don't make more of at least one European triumph, which is the Airbus A350, the latest plane to come out of there. Those of you who are old enough may remember the British aircraft industry on its own and how it basically fell down because it couldn't compete with the Americans. The A350 is a triumph of engineering. It's got hundreds of orders in line. There are many jobs in this area that do depend on it. It's a demonstration of the fact that if you take all of Europe's technology, all of Europe's best engineers, and get them to work together, you can compete with the Americans and produce something the Chinese don't have any hope of producing. And I just think that it's one of those things that you can make a positive thing about, rather than being so fearful of. It's the EU working right now.
So you at the centre of the engineering lab.
No,
A star in our midst.
I've never worked on Airbus. I have worked in engineering all my life,
Fantastic.
and I know great bits of engineering. And I also know, talking to Caroline, that facing the future, we're going to need engineering more than we ever needed it to sort out the immense problems we face in competing with fixing climate change. And a great continent like Europe is the sort of body that has been collecting up the technologies to sort it out.
Thank you. Do you mind passing it to this gentleman here?
Thank you. I'm Joe Olsen. I'm a councillor in Sheffield and Liverpool Press. Are we going to get at any point the Leave campaign pinned down on what they're actually offering? I'll just give one quick example. There was a discussion on the radio this morning of their economic projections. They say will be wonderful for Leave, which is based on a zero tariff and zero barrier unilaterally position, and the deliberate abandonment of, for example, the whole steel industry. At the same time, in another forum, they can go and say, well, we're the only people sticking for our steel industry. It's complete and utter hypocrisy. They appeal to the left and the right. Boris Johnson appeals to rails against the elites, and then the next meeting he's sucking up to the hedge funds. Are they going to be pinned down on this at all?
Peter Starring, University of Sheffield. So a lot of my research is funded by the EU, especially in climate change. And given that the current government has cancelled the CCS projects, we're reliant on Europe to drive these technologies. Where will we stand post June 23rd if the funding is cut? And do we expect a brain drain like we had in the 80s, where British scientists and engineers are leaving this country for Europe and North America?
This gentleman in front, and we will go.
Earlier this morning I saw the Strong Green's young person video. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to see this. I'm 29, so I'm not sure if it's aimed at me or not. I guess.
I think it's a baby, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not. I don't know. It's got some questionable grammar. Maybe apparently young people don't care about that. I don't know. But the question I really want to ask is: we've talked about this split between an air war and a ground war. Do we actually need to win the air war? And if so, how?
Hello, Peter Carter, Green Party. My question relates to quite a few of the questions that have gone before. In this debate, we've had a lot of facts and figures thrown at us by both sides. What we've had from the Brexit side is a lot of emotional talk, a lot of people trying to get people to leave because of an emotional reaction to the arguments. But apart from a bit of project fear from Mr. Cameron and Mr. Osborne, we haven't really had any appeal to the emotional side. And yet, there's a lot of science around that suggests that people make up their minds on these things purely on an emotional basis, not quite purely, but almost entirely on an emotional basis. So, being very scared that we would actually be swayed, the country would be swayed to leave, is there any way that we can start awakening that emotional side of people to actually staying, rather than just trying to persuade them with a lot of very persuasive facts that we've heard today? And obviously I'm on this side, so I do believe that there's a lot of facts to give to people, but facts aren't enough. We need to start appealing to the emotional side as well.
I'll make sure each of the panel give us the one emotional pitch that you can choose from. Some other.
As a young person, you mentioned it previously, not a statement. You mentioned it previously, the campaign's been quite negative, and you mentioned that it's putting a lot of people off how to deal with these debates and stuff. And as a young person, I just want to ask the panel what the campaign can do to get young people, A, to register to vote and to come out, and how the Remain campaign can get more people my age turned towards Europe and the fact that we should stay. And also there are polls coming out that say that the generational divide can swing either way, so older people are more likely to vote to leave, whereas the young people would be more inclined to turn towards Europe and be more likely to stay in. So I was wondering what the Remain campaign would be able to do to entice young people to vote and vote Remain.
One more question here, and then we'll go to...
My question comes from my professional perspective as an academic working at Sheffield Hallam University. I'm interested, my question links in a way to the question here about university research, but I'm just be interested in the views of the panel of the broader context of higher education policy and the arguments from the stay perspective on that issue. And I suppose the connecting point for me is that, is it over 40% of our young people are now going to university? So the point about
in the morning with tea buns and flags. So what is our counter going to be? By the way, I think that Boris is bananas.
Well, I mean, some of the questions were sort of falling into the category of sort of don't we agree strongly with each other, that a lot are sort of wrong. And so I won't comment on those, I won't agree with them. But just to pick up 2 points, Peter, your point about emotion, absolutely. I mean, people tend to vote, the heart is a much stronger sort of muscle, isn't it? It's a much stronger organ than the brain in politics. I mean, look, we can all take our pick. For me, I think one of the strongest emotional arguments, it might not sound too aspirational to you, but it's just safety in numbers. I think safety in numbers is a very visceral emotion, that when faced with a lot of insecurities, uncertainties and challenges, you're just safer when you do stuff together with others. And I think it's a very strong emotion, and I think it's a very strong emotion particularly these days, because there's a lot of things to be worried about. Is that project fear? No, I don't think it's project fear. I think safety is a very powerful emotion. It's not sort of poetically sort of uplifting and aspirational, but it's quite visceral, and I think it's quite an important one. So that's probably the one I would deploy more. And then there was just a couple of comments about appealing to younger voters and whether the campaigns will be successful to do so. I mean, the key argument to you at the back is it's your future. It's yours. Don't let the older generations make up your mind for you. It would be an absolute travesty, and if the polls are to be believed, and they're not always to be believed, but if they are, as you say, you know, this is not a right-left argument. This is not. It's quite different to any kind of election that any of us who are involved in politics are normally used to, which is, you know, it's this side or that side, that colour, right, left, the up, down, the rest of it, this policy, that policy. This is actually the great tension at the heart of this referendum is a generational one. And if your generation don't turn out to vote, it is more likely that we will quit. If your generation does, it is most likely that will stay. It is as simple as that. And it would be an absolute travesty if, given that, as I say, the opinion polls suggest that younger voters overwhelmingly want to stay, that they should have imposed upon them a decision which they themselves do not want for their own future. It is your future. That, much the same way that I said that Brexiteers won't live with the economic consequences if they had their wish. In very similar ways, older voters don't have to live with the consequences of the decision which they will be placing on your shoulders. And that is deeply, deeply unfair. I mean, you could, not seriously make this up, you could make a first principle argument. The only people who should be allowed to vote are those between 16 and 24, if it was in my between the 16 and 24. It's their future. You should be in the driving seat, and that I think is tremendously important. I saw some. Are you referring to this? What looked like, at least at first glance to me, pretty clumsy. It was this thing, but every word didn't have a G, as if everyone below the age of 24 can't put a G at the end. Yeah. Well, yeah. Look, I'm not a branding person. It seemed a bit clumsy, but at least they're trying.
Yeah, I think that's a very generous. I mean, it's been so slated, and I guess it means people are talking about it. Maybe that's a good thing. But I think essentially, when it's young people, it is best when young people are talking to young people, and that is where this other group, if I can give them another quick plug, called We Are Europe, are doing well. They're the ones who did that mural. Some people might not like it. I wasn't quite sure. But the one where you've got Boris and Trump in this embrace. And, I mean, I don't particularly necessarily like it, but it's gone very viral with many young people. So they know what it's going to be that's going to turn people out. And I really agree with what Nick said, that it is absolutely young people's futures at stake. In terms of higher education and some of the links to be made with young people in the universities and things like the Erasmus program, which is a fantastic program to allow research and people studying in other EU countries very easily. We've got someone from the National Union of Students, the former president, is on the board of Stronger In, and she has quite an important role on that. And I think there's just so much evidence to suggest that the kind of collaborative value added that you get when you've got different universities from different countries coming together to work on projects is really exciting. I mean, as a Green, whether I would celebrate Airbus as necessarily the most important example of that, I'm not sure, but I would love to hear of some lovely environmental technology, some renewables, whatever, that would no doubt make the same point just as eloquently. Sorry, there's so many bits and pieces down here. The thing about jobs, I'm not quite sure I understood the point that the very first speaker at the back was making, but if you were saying, and apologies if this isn't what you were saying, but if you were saying that there's only a finite number of jobs and therefore the more people you've got coming in to take them, then there will be fewer to go around, and I don't know if that was what you were saying, but if it was, I would just say that I think that when you've got entrepreneurial people from other EU countries coming into our country, they do actually create jobs themselves. I mean, I don't think it is a zero-sum game. It is a more dynamic process than that, if you like. And so I think that there's more to be said for the way in which people coming into this country are actually beginning to create jobs. Many of them are starting their own businesses and so on. So I think it's more dynamic. And I think as well, in terms of where we're going to have most influence in terms of reforming the EU, I find it hard to think we're going to have very much influence outside the EU. And one thing we haven't talked about very much at the minute is the fact that there are movements in many other EU countries right now that are also trying to make the EU more democratic and accountable and so on. There's a thing called DiEM25 that was set up by Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister in Greece, which is all about trying to make the EU more democratic and accountable. There's something called Plan B. There are many movements in many capitals around the EU with people coming up with ideas of how you could make this institution more responsive. And some of it's not rocket science. I mean, just simple things we could even do in our own government and parliament here in the UK. So, for example, why at the minute do we only ever cross-question ministers when they come back from a Brussels summit? We don't actually ask them what mandate they're going with and try to feed into that kind of mandate before they go. There are kinds of things that we could do as well with the whole kind of European scrutiny in Parliament that isn't done terribly effectively to my mind. So I will stop because I'm rambling, but essentially I think there's lots that could be done to reform the EU, but we're better off trying to do it inside than outside.
things very quickly, I think. The first one, the gentleman that made the point about the Airbus, could, as he knows, have also made the point about the revival of the British car industry, which has quite dramatically turned around from being on the skids 20 years ago to now being one of our major exports, including all the component parts and so forth. It's simply an amazing renaissance of the whole industry, largely because of the European market. Second point I'd like to make is that I think that the point that Caroline just made, which is we could take right now steps to be more democratic. Let's take one example. We appoint a commissioner, and the other countries of Europe appoint a commissioner. That commissioner doesn't have to go before Parliament, before he or she is appointed, to answer questions from Parliament about what they will do when they get to Brussels. They never go anywhere near there. They don't come back to answer questions in Parliament. We could change that tomorrow. The Prime Minister could say that he will give a part of question time, in agreement with the parties, to the Commissioner from Brussels to come and answer questions about what Brussels is doing and why. It's extraordinary to me that there's no parliamentary presence at all from the Commissioner who's appointed to represent us in Brussels, and that's why people feel so cut off. That would be a step that could be taken without anybody else's agreement by the British government anytime it wanted. And that would immediately change the whole atmosphere. And it would include, for example, answers about questions in Parliament, including the European Parliament. Final point I want to make, and this is perhaps a strange one, it goes back in a sense to what Nick said at the beginning. I'm frightened that if we leave Europe, we will end up by being a small, inward-looking, bad-tempered, sour country, dominated by people who want roses around the cottage door, and that think back a century to when they were young or their grandparents were young. It's supposed to be about the future. And Nick has already said that to our colleague who'd asked the questions as a young person. But let's push it even further. The future is, as Caroline and others have said, about what kind of environment we have, what kind of country we live in, what kind of air we breathe, what kind of dreams we have, what kind of ambitions we have. And I think one of the striking things about this argument is the attempt to go back to looking further, to having a vision about where we want to be, to being generous and decent to one another, is absolutely crucial. And I'm struck time and again by the littleness, the shrinking of the vision, which is associated, I think, with the Leave people who just want to go away and live a quiet, personally selfish life and not take on any of the great issues of the time. There are great issues. They are huge issues. You've mentioned some of them, like refugees, like poverty, like inequality. These are things that require the wisdom, the intelligence, the energy of the British people, among others. Please don't cut us off from the rest of the world to sit there dreaming of a world that's gone and having no ideas about the world that is to come.
So there are 2 points I'd like to address specifically. It's the need, first is the need to pin down the case on the Leave campaign. I think Laura made an excellent point earlier in asking what type of future we expect to see from people heavily associated with the Leave campaign, like Nigel Lawson, who's a known climate change denier, and John Redwood, where you would expect a lot of your social rights to be completely destroyed. But in many ways, their argument is like having a gym membership and then leaving the gym, but still expecting to use the equipment there, completely free of charge. And this is to slightly move on to the second point, which was about leaving Europe and then letting others sort it out and coming back. Because if we did that, then we would essentially be giving up all of our right to have a say in that and to have any feedback on it. We may still need to use some of that equipment in the future, but we're going to pay a hell of a lot more to do so, and we're not going to have much influence at all on what happens. So the best way, I feel, to change Europe is staying within it, fighting for what we want to see with Europe, working together and not pulling up the drawbridge on everyone else who is trying to stay in Europe and fight for a progressive Europe.
We're sort of coming a little bit to the end, but I just wondered whether there were any more questions. Could we have a quick fire round of... Very quickly, can we take this round? Maybe without a microphone, if you could just quickly stand up and give us a second.
This is going to sound like a stupid question. It probably is a stupid question. Everybody knows that the Remain campaign has only got to do one thing to win. That is to say something sensible and interesting about immigration. It hasn't said anything. What's the problem? So I'm sure you've discussed it amongst yourselves and decided, I can't do it.
Right. Next question. Yes.
Oh yeah, it's more an anecdotal point, but I think something to take care of is that I spoke to a lot of flatmates and friends and that, and a lot of them are trying to sort out their postal votes because they're over class and very old just out of the country. And a lot of them they weren't that fussed about it, so like, well, obviously we're going to vote Remain. So
I know.
a lot of people are thinking, or young people at least from anecdotal.
Can I just cover off that point? I'm absolutely really, really concerned. Every young person talks to each other and sort of say, well, what on earth are we doing having this debate in the first place? Of course we're going to stay. You've got to put the fear of God into your colleagues, your friends. And we've got a campaign called Students for Europe. And we are doing a big campaign saying, where are you on the 23rd of June? Because there's been another problem. There's universities have got everyone registered at university and you're not going to be there. Yeah, so please, it is absolutely crucial. And also all those who are lecturers and professors, just explain there are a lot of people out there who will vote to come out. Yes. Just stand up very quickly.
I'd like to hear what the panel have to say, not just about Britain, but about the future of Europe as a whole, and how Britain can help solve some of the big problems that Europe is saving. That Europe is facing, such as the disparity between the north and the south, the continuing problems in Greece, and just how can we, as a continent, deal with the refugee crisis.
Thank you. And then this last gentleman, I think. Right. Okay, quickly. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly say about social inequality being in this country being one of the answers to the question about immigration. So that's a problem that should be addressed at Westminster. But the question actually is about in Europe over the last few decades, we've basically tried to get things done reluctantly because we've had so many people putting us back from Europe and trying to find space. In terms of being involved, I wonder how much more we could achieve if we actually get stuck in and commit to this project.
I'd just like to mention also about those people that I have friends and relatives who are working in Europe and are retired in Europe, and what happens about them. And the Brexiters never seem to mention about the European health insurance card. What will happen to the European health insurance card when we're in Europe at the moment we get health support? Thanks.
2 or 3 sentences from everybody, if that's right, in this sort of your final point. We need this emotional argument from everybody.
So, from my point of view, I'll begin on the emotional argument. The most important issues that Europe has brought forward are things that people can see in their day-to-day lives. It's things like the fact that in the 70s we couldn't go down to the beach and enjoy a day out with our families. We now have 632 clean blue flag beaches across the country, which is a massive improvement from the original 18. So if there's one success story of the European Union, that's something that everyone can understand. It's something that everyone can relate to. And if we need a positive emotional argument, that's one which I would be making. The other would be peace, but I'll let others talk about that who may wish to. On some of the points with regard to the students and actually all young people potentially being away during the actual referendum, it is about reiterating the point that we can't let another generation who are, in some ways, you could say they're on their way out. If you're going to be cynical about these things, you can't let generations who have had their shot at deciding the future of Europe back in '74 decided for younger generations now. We need to make sure that younger generations are able to make this once-in-a-lifetime decision, hopefully in collaboration with the older generations, because one of the great successes of the Equal Marriage campaign in Ireland was actually the younger generations getting involved and motivated and telling their stories to their grandparents about why they want them to vote in favour of equal marriage. And we need to replicate that type of campaign. And we need to get out there as young people to make that argument to older generations, because, to be honest, I've spoke with my grandparents about this, and they were very Eurosceptic to begin with. They're now seeing that actually it is a decision in some ways for a younger generation, and they're happy to vote in the interests of their grandchildren. And very finally, I've lost my train of thought. I will end on that note. I'll leave you on the cliffhanger.
You don't need to really, because I think you did a brilliant job of persuading your grandparents.
Yes.
But let me just add two things. One is, we need to think much bigger than we do about things like refugee problem. We've got to recognise it's there, and we've got to take part in finding some kind of solution to it. After the Second World War, there was something called the Marshall Plan. It was big thinking by the United States at that time, and it actually enabled great chunks of Europe to turn around from sinking in what one might call a kind of attitude of total depression. There's no future for us, it's all over. Into the sense that they could actually grapple with the problems that confronted them and find wonderful answers. Europe came out of that war with positive attitudes and positive commitments. The real war before it came out with nothing but despair. The younger generation will not only vote for what it cares about, it will take a grip on the questions that are in front of it. And that's why we've been pointing to things like the attitudes have been taken towards climate change, not despair, not arguing there's none, as one does get in some parts of the United States, but a real belief that we could do something about it. And if you look at attitudes like war and peace, let me just remind you of one thing. It was European leadership that led to taking Iran out of a list of countries about to be involved in nuclear war into a list of countries which it's now part of, which is seeking answers to removing nuclear weapons bit by bit from our society. That achievement was a staggering achievement, the one great victory for peace in the last few years. You can do it. Young England and young Scotland and young Wales can do it, as long as they're prepared to face up to the scale of the problem and come up with answers that are as big as the problems were themselves.
Just one the gentleman there talked about, you're quite right. I mean, one of the points that of course needs to be made about immigration, it's a two-way street. There are 1.2 million Brits who live and study, work abroad, or retire abroad, elsewhere in the European Union. What if we were to pull out? Why should Spanish taxpayers, as Miriam keeps reminding me, why should Spanish taxpayers continue to pay for the healthcare, welfare, public services of thousands of British retirees if Spaniards are basically being told they're not welcome here anymore? It's a two-way street. We benefit immensely as Brits from having that freedom to travel and work abroad as well. And can I just, Shirley as ever has put us all to shame by just putting it so beautifully. I do think that this issue of just demonstrating that Europe has the capacity to take big decisions when confronted by big challenges is, I mean, it might sound almost trite, but it is actually the biggest problem. When people say, no, the European Union should be reformed for that, we should fiddle with this direction or fiddle with that. Actually, the thing that frustrates me most about the European Union now, by far, is its inability to take decisions. Its inability, as the gentleman there quite rightly pointed out. I mean, this imbalance between the creditor north and the debtor south in the Eurozone is socially and economically crippling for Southern Europe. It's not a reason for Britain to exit, but it's something that anyone of any humanity should be very, very concerned about. The total gridlock between, Berlin Schäuble-style orthodoxy and the self-evident economic and social needs of the Southern Europe. It just a decision needs to be made. Schengen, which has proved to be deeply flawed, because in the modern world, when people move great distances, you can either have no external borders and internal borders, or you can have internal borders and no external. You can't not have either, which is what Schengen's got. Of course, it's now got this awful spectacle of people sticking up barbed wire fences. In fact, again, the inability of people across the European Union to act collectively in the face of such an obvious collective challenge about how to behave in a humane and sensible way to all these desperate people fleeing war and conflict in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. That's what frustrates me, is that we've lost the gift, which as Shirley quite rightly reminds us, was a gift that the war generation understood, is that sometimes by taking big decisions on big issues together, you actually answer the longing that people have, that their leaders can actually lead sensibly and wisely on their behalves in a representative democracy. And that is what is lacking. And what is so self-harming about this debate is that if Britain were to withdraw from all of this, we'd also take off the table, in many respects, our natural leadership gifts as a country. Look at foreign defence policy. Other than France, there is no other country in the European Union that can in any way shift the dial. But on so many other things else, other things as well, international diplomacy, environmental policies, economic policies, Britain could lead if we chose to. But because we have a political class, particularly in one party, who spend all their time arguing with each other, we're betraying everybody else by not actually exercising the natural leadership which is ours to take in the United Kingdom. So I think at the end of the day, the question is, as I said at the outset, what kind of country do we want to be? Do we want to shape or lead our own destiny? Or, as Shirley again so beautifully put, do we want to be some grumpy, divided rump of an island drifting somewhere off the south coast of Greenland? Well, nothing against Greenland, but I know exactly where I'd rather be.
Thank you. One of the questions was about what about the future of the EU? Instead of having to keep defending what the EU has done till now, then what is our vision of what Europe could do in the future? And I do think there's lots that can be said about that. We could be talking about what we call a Green New Deal right across the EU. In other words, an amazing way of investing in green technology, green energy, energy efficiency, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, getting fuel poverty down, tackling climate change at the same time. Doing that across Europe would be a fantastically positive thing to do. We could be talking about a minimum wage in each European country. I don't mean a common EU minimum wage, we're way off that. But we could be lobbying for that. We could be encouraging, we could be supporting, we could say why this matters, so that you would begin to tackle that huge disparity that there is between the different countries of the EU. When it comes to the refugee crisis, actually not many people know that the Commission actually did come up with a pretty progressive plan whereby we could deal with at least some of the big challenge that the greatest movement of people since the Second World War is presenting. In other words, the Commission came up with a plan whereby you could think about how different countries in the EU could step up to their responsibility based on their GDP, based on their population density, the numbers of jobs, the number of refugees they'd already taken in. There is lots that the EU could do in terms of being a real leader in environmental terms, in social terms, in human rights terms. But it means that we need to be freed up from having this argument before we can play our role in really making that happen. The gentleman at the front here asked us a question at the very beginning, and I don't want us to not answer it, because then that will simply reinforce the burden of his question, which is why are we not talking about immigration in a different way? And you didn't say it explicitly, but I suspect what we meant by that is, why don't we start saying that immigration is a bad thing, and then that would
I don't mean that. I mean, why don't you have some sort of things that stand up to what Nigel Farage says?
Well,
it doesn't have to be completely negative, but it has to sound as though you mean it and you would do it.
Well, I hope I did mean it when I was talking about actually saying that freedom of movement, in other words, within the 28 member states, is something that I think is culturally positive. It is something that is economically positive. I think we could make more of that latter point by ring-fencing some of that money and making sure that we're investing it in places that are under pressure. But that really relates, the reason I wanted to come back to that was partly to reinforce what Nick said about the numbers of people that are already from the UK living in other countries and what are the implications for them if we suddenly begin to pull back the drawbridge. But also about, again, what kind of country are we? And I want to come back with my final point about the question about, well, what is the emotional argument here? I really liked Nick's emotional argument, and I would have nicked that one if he hadn't got there first. In other words, this idea of safety in numbers. And the other one, I haven't got quite the right words to put it in yet, but it is something about saying, I really hate the phrase EU migrant. I think it's a horrible word. You know, EU migrants are actually our friends, our doctors, the people in our local shop that we know, the people we see in the street. EU migrants are actually some of the people that enrich our culture, our music, you know, the people that are around us, our wives, our mothers-in-laws, or whoever. You know, these are our friends and neighbours and our community. And the more that we can get that message across, that we are talking about people who we know and love, not just some kind of abstract concept that is added up in tens of thousands, then perhaps we'll get people to think about the EU in the way that I think is more helpful.
I just want to say that this has been a great, great panel, and thank you all so much. Thank you in particular also to the audience. But before we close and say a huge thank you to our eminent panel, I would just like to add a couple of things, one particularly on the issue of immigration. There is a reason why we have unparalleled immigration from the EU, and that is because, if I can say this here, the economy is doing quite well. Now, you can tank the economy and then you get rid of migration. And what we've got a problem with is actually very much domestic policies around skills, around training, around absolutely upskilling our apprenticeship schemes, etc., etc. It is in our hands as well. And I think some of us in this room might remember a program called A Vida Sem Pé, where actually reciprocal immigration and freedom of movement rights worked for everybody. I would like to just throw out my last point, which I think, well, 2 points. One is, I think the line is, you don't get greater control over your country by losing power in your continent. It is absolutely not a zero-sum game. And my very last point is actually one that Paddy Ashdown made, and that is, Brexit is not just for Christmas. Thank you very much indeed.